Most murders get solved. Witnesses talk, forensics close in, someone eventually confesses. But mob murders operated by a completely different set of rules. No witnesses would come forward. Bodies vanished. Evidence disappeared. Judges and police were often on the payroll. The men who ordered the killings had enough money, power, and reach to bury the truth indefinitely. And in most cases, that is exactly what they did. The 10 cases in this series span nearly a century, from Arnold Rothstein in 1928 to the Blackfriars Massacre in 1978. Across all of them, the pattern is identical. Someone with power, money, or dangerous secrets died violently. The mob closed around the truth like a fist. Investigations stalled. Suspects died before trial. Charges were dropped. Grand juries were convened and produced nothing. In some cases, the killers were known to investigators for decades. It made no difference. Not a single one of these 10 murders ended in a conviction. That is not coincidence. That is a system working exactly as designed. 1. Arnold Rothstein, The Brain, 1928. Arnold Rothstein was born on January 17, 1882 in Manhattan, New York. His father, Abraham Rothstein, was a well-respected Jewish businessman known around the community as Abe the Just. His older brother Harry went on to become a rabbi. Arnold went in the opposite direction entirely. He dropped out of school at 16. He had little interest in any subject except arithmetic, and he was sharp at it because numbers meant gambling. He worked briefly as a traveling salesman but quit when the money felt too small. By his early 20s, he had opened his own casino using cash he won at cards and craps. From that point, the street was his office. By the 1920s, Rothstein had built something unlike anything the criminal world had seen before. He was not a street thug. He did not run with a gang or carry a gun for hire. He wore tailored suits, drove a Rolls-Royce, and kept a private booth at Lindy's Deli on Broadway, where he conducted business every night. He lent money to bootleggers, fixed horse races, paid off judges and police, and served as a middleman between politicians and crime bosses. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Bugsy Siegel all had connections to him early in their careers. He mentored them not just in crime, but in how to carry themselves, how to dress, how to move through the world without looking like criminals. Luciano later said Rothstein taught him how to use a knife and fork at a dinner table, how to hold a door open for a woman, how to buy a properly tailored suit. Rothstein also always carried an enormous wad of $100 bills on him, which earned him the nickname the Big Bankroll. He was worth an estimated $50 million at his peak. That kind of money meant he could finance almost anything. And in 1919, he allegedly financed one of the most infamous sports scandals in American history. 8 Chicago White Sox players agreed to lose the 1919 World Series on purpose in exchange for payment from a gambling ring. The scheme required someone with very deep pockets to back it. That person, according to multiple accounts, was Rothstein. Most historians believe he placed approximately $270,000 in bets on the underdog Cincinnati Reds to win the series that year. When the scandal broke and Rothstein was called before a grand jury, he denied any involvement and shifted blame to his associate, Abe Attell. He was never convicted. He was never even indicted. The 8 White Sox players were banned from baseball for life. Rothstein walked away clean, publicly at least, and announced in September 1921 that he was through with gambling, a statement almost nobody believed. The real end of Rothstein came not from a courtroom, but from a card game. On September 8, 1928, Rothstein sat down at a high-stakes 5-card stud game organized by fellow gambler George McManus at an apartment on West 54th Street. The game ran for 13 hours. By the time it ended, Rothstein owed $320,000, equivalent to roughly $6 million today. He refused to pay. His position was that the game had been fixed against him. The men he owed, particularly a West Coast gambler named Nate Raymond and poker hustler Alvin Titanic Thompson, were not happy. McManus, who had organized the game and vouched for everyone at the table, was now on the hook for collecting money Rothstein had no intention of paying. For nearly 2 months, Rothstein stalled. He told people he expected to win $550,000 on the November election results. He had bet heavily on Herbert Hoover for president and Franklin Roosevelt for governor, and that he would settle after that. But time ran out before the election could. On the evening of November 4th, 1928, Rothstein was at his usual booth at Lindy's when a phone call came in at around 10:15 p.m. The caller was McManus. After a brief conversation, Rothstein walked over to his associate, James Meehan, and said, "McManus wants me over at the Park Central." He handed Meehan his pearl-handled pistol, said it would not take long, and left on foot for the hotel a few blocks away. Less than an hour later, hotel staff found Rothstein hunched over and bleeding heavily near the service entrance of the Park Central, a single .38 caliber bullet wound to the abdomen. He had dragged himself through the hallway and collapsed before making it outside. He was rushed to Stuyvesant Polyclinic Hospital. Police went to work immediately, but Rothstein refused to cooperate. When asked who shot him, he put his finger to his lips. When pressed harder, his response was, "You stick to your trade."
"I'll stick to mine." He never gave up a name. He slipped into unconsciousness the following afternoon and died on the morning of November 6, 1928, Election Day. He had bet heavily on the results. Had he lived, he would have collected $570,000. His death canceled all the wagers. Police charged George McManus. His coat had been found in room 349 of the Park Central, the room where investigators believed the shooting took place. But the DA could not actually prove Rothstein had ever entered that room. No witness could put McManus at the scene at the time of the shooting. McManus was acquitted. He walked out of court wearing the very overcoat that had just been used as a prosecutor's exhibit. The investigation collapsed almost immediately afterward. Hundreds of pages of Rothstein's personal papers went missing after his death. His attorney told reporters at the time that when Rothstein's safe deposit boxes were opened, there would be a lot of suicides, meaning the files contained information that could destroy powerful people. Those files were never fully recovered. The politicians, judges, and businessmen Rothstein had in his pocket never faced any scrutiny. Other theories about who killed him have circulated for nearly a century. Some say Dutch Schultz ordered the hit in retaliation for the murder of his associate, Joey Noe. Others point to McManus's bagman, Hyman Biller, who fled to Cuba shortly after the shooting. Some researchers believe Titanic Thompson set up the September poker game specifically to bleed Rothstein dry and provoke a confrontation that would end with his death. Nobody was ever convicted. The case has been officially open and unsolved since 1928. Rothstein's death changed the shape of organized crime in New York. His empire fractured almost immediately. The men he had mentored, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, moved quickly to fill the vacuum. Within a few years, they had reorganized crime in America entirely, building the structures that would define the mob for the next 5 decades. The man who built those foundations died on a hospital bed, refusing to say a single word that might lead to justice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Up next is a murder that happened in broad daylight at one of New York's most famous hotels, with 14 eyewitnesses present and 100 detectives assigned to the case. And still, nobody was ever charged. 2. Bugsy Siegel, the man who built Vegas, 1947. Benjamin Siegel was born on February 28, 1906, in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, New York. His parents were poor Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants from Russia. He grew up with almost nothing and decided early that he was going to change that by any means necessary. Williamsburg in that era was a neighborhood divided by ethnic lines. Irish gangs, Italian gangs, and Jewish street crews each claimed their corners. Violence was not exceptional. It was the weather. Young Siegel watched his father grind through brutal work for almost no pay and decided before he was a teenager that he wanted no part of that life. By the time he was 14, Siegel had started his own racket. He approached pushcart peddlers on the Lower East Side, offering protection from theft and vandalism. When they refused, he doused the carts in kerosene and set them on fire, then came back to demand payment. It was extortion from the start. He was creating the problem and charging people to make it stop. That logic would govern his entire life. Around 1918, he met Meyer Lansky, another tough Jewish kid from the same streets. The two formed what became known as the Bugs and Meyer mob. Lansky was the strategist. Siegel was the muscle, the one who never hesitated. His gang members called him Bugsy because of his explosive, unpredictable temper. The slang term Bugs meant crazy. He hated the nickname his entire life. Anyone who used it to his face risked serious injury. Through the 1920s, the Bugs and Meyer mob expanded into bootlegging, car theft, and contract killing. They hijacked liquor shipments from rival outfits and handled enforcement work across New York and New Jersey. One associate recalled years later that Siegel was fearless in a way that went beyond confidence. When danger arrived, he moved toward it rather than away from it. That made him valuable, and it also made him dangerous to everyone around him, including his friends. In May 1929, Lansky and Siegel attended the Atlantic City Conference, a major summit organized by Lucky Luciano at the Ritz-Carlton. The gathering was a planning session for the future of American organized crime. Jewish and Italian criminal organizations were being brought together under a unified structure that would eventually become the National Crime Syndicate. Siegel argued that the ethnic divisions between gangs were bad for business and that the two sides should operate as partners. Siegel was connected directly to Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and the upper structure of the syndicate. In 1931, he was reputedly one of the gunmen who shot New York mob boss Joe Masseria to death in a restaurant in Coney Island, ending the Castellamarese War on Luciano's orders. No charges were ever filed. He and Lansky also pushed for the creation of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the syndicate responsible for carrying out contract killings across the country. By his mid-20s, Siegel had enough money to rent at the Waldorf Astoria and buy a Tudor house in Scarsdale. He was also handsome, well-dressed, and consumed by his own image. He had suits custom-tailored, wore silk shirts, and applied face creams at night. He was terrified of losing his hair. He once said that class was the only thing that counted in life, and that without it, a man might as well be dead. The poverty of Williamsburg was something he intended to put so far behind him that no one who met him would ever be able to see it. When Lansky decided the heat in New York was getting too intense around 1936, he sent Siegel west to take over mob operations on the West Coast. Siegel moved to Los Angeles and immediately began consolidating gambling dens, offshore gambling ships, bookmaking wire services, and narcotics. But California gave him something New York never could: access to Hollywood. Through his childhood friend, actor George Raft, Siegel worked his way into the entertainment industry's social circles. He became friends with Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, Cary Grant, and Jean Harlow. Studio executives Louis B. Mayer and Jack Warner treated him with the careful deference that came from understanding exactly what he was capable of. Siegel bought a home in Beverly Hills, threw parties, and carried himself through that world with a confidence that came from knowing he was the most dangerous man in any room he walked into. Then came the murder charge. On Thanksgiving night, November 22, 1939, Siegel helped lead a team of associates to the Hollywood Hills home of Harry Greenberg, a childhood friend from Brooklyn who had made the catastrophic mistake of threatening to expose what he knew about the syndicate unless he was paid $5,000. Prosecutors charged that Frankie Carbo shot Greenberg 5 times in the head in his own driveway, and that Siegel drove one of the getaway cars and led the killers to the address. Siegel went on trial in 1941. The key prosecution witness was Albert Tannenbaum, a Murder, Inc. hitman turned informant. Another critical witness, Abe Relis, had agreed to testify, but died after falling from a window at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. The circumstances of his death were never satisfactorily explained. With Relis gone and 2 other witnesses also dead, the case collapsed. The jury acquitted Siegel after deliberating for just over an hour. Then came Las Vegas. In the early 1940s, Las Vegas was a small desert town. Siegel had already sent his associate Mo Sedway to manage operations there. In 1945, he returned with larger ambitions, joining a group that purchased the El Cortez Casino. But he had already fixed his attention on something else. Billy Wilkerson, founder of The Hollywood Reporter and a compulsive gambler, had started building a luxury resort on Highway 91. He ran out of money. Siegel and Lansky bought in as partners. Siegel pushed Wilkerson out entirely, and from that point, ran the project himself. The plan was to build something with no precedent in Nevada, a resort operating at the level of glamour associated with the best European hotels, designed to pull in wealthy tourists from Los Angeles and put Las Vegas on the map as a destination. The building was named the Flamingo. Virginia Hill was not a passive presence in Siegel's life. Born in Lipscomb, Alabama in 1916, she had moved to Chicago as a teenager and worked her way into the inner circles of the Chicago outfit, handling money and running courier operations. The Senate Kefauver Committee would later describe her as the intellectual director of the Chicago outfit's narcotics trafficking operation in Mexico. She was not a woman who had stumbled into the underworld by proximity to a dangerous man. She was already a professional criminal when she met Siegel. The problem was that Siegel had no experience running a construction project and made expensive decisions constantly. He ordered separate sewage lines for every room. He bought materials at inflated prices. Contractors billed him twice for the same shipments, and he did not catch it. The original budget was around $1.2 million. By the time the Flamingo opened on December 26, 1946, costs had climbed past $6 million. The mob had put up most of that money, and they wanted it back. The more damaging accusation was not mismanagement, but theft. The story circulating among syndicate leadership was that Siegel and Virginia Hill had been skimming construction money and sending it to Swiss bank accounts throughout the build. Whether or not this was true, enough powerful people believed it to make the distinction irrelevant. In late 1946 and early 1947, key figures in the National Crime Syndicate met in Havana, Cuba. Lucky Luciano attended. The question of what to do about Siegel was on the agenda. The decision reached was that he needed to be killed. Lansky, according to multiple accounts, had reluctantly agreed. The 2 men had been close friends since they were children on the streets of Brooklyn. That friendship did not save him. Virginia Hill flew to Paris on June 10, 1947, a week before the shooting. On the evening of June 20th, Siegel went to the house at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills, leased in Hill's name, to collect some clothes. He and his associate Alan Smiley sat together on a sofa in the living room reading newspapers. The lamp beside Siegel's head was on. The drapes were open. At 10:45 in the evening, a sniper positioned outside the front window fired 9 shots into the room. Siegel was hit 4 times, twice in the head and twice in the torso. he died instantly. One of the headshots blew his left eye out of its socket. It came to rest on the tiled dining room floor approximately 15 feet from the sofa. Alan Smiley, who dropped to the floor when the shooting started, survived. 3 bullets passed through the sleeve of his jacket without touching his body. The gunman disappeared into the night. Within minutes of the shooting, Gus Greenbaum, Mo Sedway, and Morris Rosen walked into the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas and announced they were now in charge. The timing made clear this had been planned well in advance. No one was ever charged. Frankie Carbo was among the suspects named over the decades. No evidence was ever produced that could hold up in court. Siegel's funeral lasted 5 minutes. Only 5 people attended. Lansky, the man who had known him since they were children running the same streets, was not there. The Flamingo is still operating on the Las Vegas Strip today, the oldest continuously running resort on the Strip. The eventual success of that hotel, and the wave of development it helped trigger along the highway heading out of the desert, built the city that Las Vegas became. Siegel did not live to see any of it. The case remains officially unsolved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next is a case from 1957 where 2 masked men walked into a New York City hotel barbershop in broad daylight, shot a mob boss 5 times in front of 14 witnesses, and still managed to escape without a single person ever facing trial for it. 3. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, 1957. Albert Anastasia was born Umberto Anastasio on September 26, 1902, in Parghelia, Calabria, in the south of Italy. His father was a railway worker who died after World War I, leaving behind 9 sons and 3 daughters in a region that had very little to offer any of them. When Albert was around 15 years old, he went to sea on a freighter with his brother Tony. When the ship docked at the Brooklyn waterfront in 1919, the 2 brothers walked off the boat and never went back. They had entered the United States illegally, and they had no intention of leaving. Both brothers found work as longshoremen on the Brooklyn docks, the same waterfront community that would define much of what followed. The work was hard, the men around them were hard, and the line between the docks and organized crime was thin to the point of being meaningless. It did not take long for Albert to collide with it violently. In March 1921, he was convicted of murdering a longshoreman named George Torino following a dispute. He was sentenced to death and sent to Sing Sing prison to wait for his execution date. Then, the witnesses disappeared. All 4 of the key witnesses against him were gone before his retrial could be held. With no one left to testify, the case collapsed entirely. Anastasia walked out of custody in 1922, a free man. He had been on death row and beaten it, not through any demonstration of innocence, but because the people who could put him there had simply ceased to exist. It was the first demonstration of a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 3.5 decades. Anastasia was prosecuted repeatedly and convicted of nothing. The witnesses always seemed to go away. He changed his last name from Anastasio to Anastasia around this time, partly to put some distance between himself and the press coverage that attached to his criminal career, and partly to shield his family from it. His brother Tony kept the original name and went a different direction, eventually controlling the Brooklyn docks through the Longshoremen's Union. Albert went the other direction entirely. He climbed through the ranks of organized crime during Prohibition, allied himself with Lucky Luciano, and positioned himself at the violent center of what the syndicate was becoming. By the early 1930s, Anastasia and labor racketeer Louis Buchalter had been placed in charge of the National Crime Syndicate's enforcement arm. The press named it Murder, Inc. It operated out of the back room of a candy store called Midnight Roses in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. Killers affiliated with the organization could be dispatched to any city in the country to carry out contract murders for syndicate bosses, with the key principle being that the killer had no personal connection to the target and therefore no obvious motive. Historians have estimated the organization was responsible for somewhere between 400 and 1,000 murders during its years of operation. Anastasia ran the killers. He earned two nicknames that followed him for the rest of his life: the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner. Every time prosecutors got close,
The cases fell apart. Witnesses went missing. Witnesses died. Witnesses suddenly could not remember what they had seen. The pattern was so consistent and so reliable that it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like policy. In 1941, the policy nearly failed. A Brooklyn killer named Abe Rellis, who ran a crew of Brownsville hitmen for Anastasia and was known to his associates as Kid Twist, was arrested on murder charges and made a decision that very few men in his position ever made. He agreed to cooperate with the government in exchange for avoiding the electric chair. His testimony was extraordinary. He gave prosecutors detailed accounts of murders across the organization that they had never been able to solve, and 7 Murder Inc. members went to prison on the strength of what he told them. He also had direct information implicating Anastasia personally in 2 murders. Anastasia responded by putting a $100,000 reward on Rellis's head. On November 12, 1941, while Rellis was being kept under protective custody on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, guarded by 6 police officers, he was found dead on the roof of a lower section of the building beneath his window. A 1951 grand jury ruled it an accidental fall. Investigators who worked the case and journalists who studied it for years afterward believed he had been thrown. How 6 police officers guarding a single man failed to prevent or witness what happened to him was a question that was never satisfactorily answered. Anastasia was never charged. The $100,000 reward had been worth every cent. Through the 1940s, Anastasia continued to operate as one of the most feared figures in American organized crime. He was not a quiet, administrative boss. He was a man who had personally committed murders and who ran his operations through the constant, implicit threat of violence. His bosses within the syndicate structure were Vincent Mangano and his brother Philip, who headed the family to which Anastasia belonged. The relationship between Anastasia and Vincent Mangano was one of sustained mutual hostility. Mangano was wary of Anastasia and understood correctly that the man beneath him was dangerous in ways that were difficult to contain. In April 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared and was never found. His brother Philip was found shot to death in Jamaica Bay, shot twice in the face and once in the neck. Anastasia appeared before the Mafia Commission and presented a straightforward argument. The Manganos had been planning to kill him first, so he had acted in self-defense. He did not admit to killing them. Frank Costello, one of the most influential figures in the commission at the time, backed him up. The commission accepted his explanation and gave Anastasia control of the family. He renamed it the Anastasia crime family. Nobody challenged him. 2 bosses had been murdered, and the response from the governing body of American organized crime was to hand the man most likely responsible for those murders a promotion. Then, in March 1952, Anastasia did something that alarmed even the people around him. A 24-year-old clothing salesman named Arnold Schuster had been riding the New York City subway when he spotted Willie Sutton, a famous bank robber who had been on the run from federal authorities. Schuster followed Sutton, confirmed his identity, and called the police. Sutton was arrested. Schuster gave interviews, went on television, and was celebrated publicly as a hero who had done his civic duty. He had no connection to organized crime. He was a young man who had recognized a fugitive on a train and done what he thought a responsible citizen should do. Anastasia watched one of those television appearances and allegedly told the men around him that he could not stand squealers and that someone should take care of the kid.
On March 8, 1952, Arnold Schuster was shot to death on a Brooklyn street. He had been shot twice in the groin and once in each eye. The murder produced a wave of public outrage and genuine alarm among mob bosses across the country. Killing a civilian with no connection to the underworld, a young man whose only offense was cooperating with police in the arrest of a bank robber, was exactly the kind of act that brought the full weight of government attention down on everyone. It was reckless in a way that threatened the entire organization. Government witness Joseph Valachi publicly accused Anastasia of ordering the hit during Senate hearings in 1963. No one was ever arrested for the murder of Arnold Schuster. The killing illustrated a problem that had been growing for years. Anastasia was erratic. His violence had always been extreme, but it had generally been directed at people connected to the world he operated in. The Schuster murder suggested his judgment could not be trusted in the way it once could. He was ordering the deaths of people because he saw them on television and did not like what they represented. That kind of thinking was difficult to predict and impossible to control. He had also been selling membership positions in his crime family for $50,000 each, allowing men to be formally inducted into the family in exchange for cash payments. This violated commission rules directly and angered powerful figures across the organization. The practice was seen as cheapening the structure that everyone depended on for stability, and it generated resentment among bosses who followed the established protocols. Vito Genovese had been waiting for years for an opportunity to position himself as the dominant figure in New York organized crime. He had fled to Italy in 1937 to escape a murder charge, returned to the United States after the war when the charge was eventually dropped, and had been carefully maneuvering ever since. He understood that the path to the top ran through Anastasia, and that the most effective way to remove Anastasia was to turn the people closest to him. He found his most important ally in Anastasia's own underboss, Carlo Gambino. The arrangement between them was uncomplicated. Gambino would help remove Anastasia, and in return, Gambino would take over the family. Gambino agreed. In May 1957, Genovese made the first move. He sent a shooter named Vincent Gigante to kill Frank Costello, Anastasia's most important ally and protector on the commission, outside his apartment building in Manhattan. Costello was walking into his building when Gigante shot him in the head. The bullet grazed his skull badly enough to drop him, but not badly enough to kill him. Costello survived, assessed his situation, and chose to step back from power rather than engage in a war. With Costello removed from the board, Anastasia was isolated in a way he had not been before. His most reliable defender in the room where decisions were made was gone. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia was driven from his 25-room mansion in Fort Lee, New Jersey, into Manhattan by his chauffeur, Anthony Coppola. His destination was Grasso's barber shop inside the Park Sheraton Hotel on West 56th Street at 7th Avenue. It was a place he visited regularly and comfortably, part of his established routine. Coppola parked the car in an underground garage and then walked away, leaving Anastasia without a driver, without a bodyguard, and without any protection whatsoever. Anastasia sat down in chair 4, and the barber draped hot towels over his face. His eyes were covered. His back was to the door. Two men wearing fedoras, aviator sunglasses, and scarves pulled up around their faces walked through the hotel lobby and into the barber shop. One moved to Anastasia's left and shoved the barber out of the way at gunpoint. The other took position to his right. They opened fire simultaneously, one with a .32 caliber revolver and one with a .38. 5 bullets struck Anastasia. He lurched forward out of the chair in the direction of the two shooters, disoriented and wounded. But what he was actually moving toward was their reflections in the mirror in front of him. He had turned himself around. He hit the mirror, shattering it, and collapsed to the floor in a pile of blood-soaked towels. The two men walked out through the hotel lobby and disappeared into the street. 14 people witnessed the killing. 100 detectives were assigned to the investigation. Nobody was ever charged. One of the guns was recovered the following day from a litter basket beside the hotel. NYPD investigators concluded the hit had been arranged by Genovese and Gambino. A mob figure named Joey Gallo later told an associate that if anyone wanted to know who did it, they could call the five of them the Barbershop Quintet. No charges followed that statement either. Gambino was confirmed as the new boss of the family at a major syndicate summit planned for November 1957 at a farm in Appalachian, New York. State troopers raided that meeting, turning it into an embarrassment that exposed the existence of a national organized crime structure to the public and caused serious problems for Genovese specifically. Gambino, however, came through the Appalachian raid intact. He went on to run what became the Gambino crime family until his death from a heart attack in 1976. He was never charged with the murder of Albert Anastasia. The barbershop inside the Park Sheraton Hotel is now a Starbucks. The chair Anastasia was sitting in when he was shot, Chair 4, was auctioned off for $7,000 and is currently on display at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. The case has never been officially solved. No one was ever prosecuted for one of the most public mob killings in American history, carried out in a hotel barbershop in Midtown Manhattan, with 14 witnesses present and 100 detectives working the investigation. The witnesses, as usual, did not see enough to put anyone away. The pattern that had started in 1921, when 4 witnesses against Anastasia disappeared before his retrial, held to the very end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a mob boss shot 7 times in broad daylight in a busy hotel parking lot, with a convicted felon about to cooperate with federal authorities, and a murder that still has not been cracked more than 40 years later. 4. Sam Giancana, the Chicago Boss, 1975. Salvatore Giancana was born on May 24, 1908, in a rough Italian immigrant neighborhood on the west side of Chicago known as The Patch. His parents were Sicilian immigrants who had come to America and landed in one of the most insular, self-contained criminal communities in the country. The Patch was the kind of place where the line between legitimate work and organized crime had been blurred for so long that most people who grew up there stopped being able to see it at all. By the time he was a teenager, Giancana had already been sent to a reformatory. He was running errands for local criminals before he was old enough to shave. He joined the 42 Gang, a street crew that operated at the bottom of Chicago's organized crime structure, carrying out the low-level work that kept the machine running. Thefts, intimidation, collections, whatever was needed. Police suspected him in at least 3 murders before he turned 20. He was never tried for any of them. What got him noticed was not his willingness to kill. Plenty of young men in that world were willing to kill. What set him apart was his skill behind the wheel. He was an exceptional getaway driver, cool under pressure and precise in situations where most people panicked. That ability moved him upward. He drove for Al Capone's operation and for senior outfit figures, including a man named Tony Accardo, who would later play a central role in how Giancana's story ended. By 1939, Giancana had been convicted of bootlegging and served time in federal prison. When he came out in 1942, he made the move that defined the next decade of his life. He persuaded Accardo to let him lead the violent takeover of Chicago's black lottery rackets on the South Side. The policy game, as the illegal lottery was known, was generating millions of dollars every year for whoever controlled it. The existing operators were not going to give it up voluntarily. Giancana used kidnappings and murders to remove them. By the early 1950s, those rackets were entirely under outfit control, and Giancana had made himself into someone the organization depended on. He got results. That was the only currency that mattered. In 1957,
Tony Accardo stepped back from day-to-day operations and named Giancana the Chicago outfit's front boss. Accardo and his senior partner, Paul Ricca, retained real power behind the scenes, but Giancana was now the public face of the most powerful mob organization in America outside of New York. He was loud where his predecessors had been quiet, visible where they had been invisible, and personally flamboyant in ways that generated attention the outfit had historically avoided. He dated singer Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire Sisters and moved through entertainment circles with a comfort that advertised exactly who he was. Under his leadership, the outfit expanded its reach into Las Vegas casinos, offshore gambling operations in Cuba, Great Britain, and Iran, and built political connections that eventually reached the highest levels of American government. In 1960, the CIA came looking for him. Fidel Castro had taken power in Cuba in 1959 and shut down the mob's casino operations there, eliminating a significant revenue stream for multiple organized crime families. The CIA wanted Castro dead. Agency documents declassified in 2007 confirmed that in September 1960, the CIA recruited mob associate Johnny Roselli as an intermediary to connect them with Giancana and Tampa mob boss Santo Trafficante. A CIA frontman offered $150,000 for the job. Giancana suggested using poison pills rather than firearms, reasoning that a shooting could be traced back, while a poisoning would look like natural causes. The CIA manufactured the pills and provided them to a Cuban official who had access to Castro. The plan failed when the official lost his nerve. The plots continued in various forms through the early 1960s, but Castro survived all of them. Giancana was not operating out of patriotism. His view of the CIA arrangement, as later described by people who knew him, was that it was leverage, a way to create goodwill with federal authorities, and, if necessary, a way to remind them that both parties had things they would prefer to keep quiet. That same year, 1960, the Chicago outfit was deeply involved in the presidential election. Giancana later claimed he had helped deliver Illinois to John F. Kennedy through the manipulation of ballot counts in Cook County. Kennedy won Illinois narrowly, and Illinois was considered decisive in his victory over Richard Nixon. What followed was one of the more bitter ironies in the history of American organized crime. Kennedy appointed his brother Robert as Attorney General, and Robert Kennedy immediately launched one of the most aggressive federal campaigns against organized crime the country had ever seen. FBI recordings made at Giancana's headquarters, the Armory Lounge in Forest Park, Illinois, captured him in 1959, complaining with intense fury about Robert Kennedy's relentless pursuit of mob figures. The man he believed he had helped put in the White House had sent his brother to destroy him. The FBI surveillance was itself a problem. Agents had planted a microphone in the Armory Lounge and were recording conversations that connected Giancana to an enormous range of criminal activity. He was under constant observation. He was photographed everywhere he went, followed on golf courses, watched outside restaurants. He reportedly approached his FBI surveillance team at one point and engaged them in direct conversation about how thoroughly they were documenting his life. By 1965, the federal pressure had become severe enough that Giancana was called before a grand jury. He refused to testify even after being granted immunity from prosecution, which removed his Fifth Amendment protection and left him with no legal basis for his silence. He was jailed for contempt of court and held for over a year, the full duration of the grand jury's term. While he was in prison, Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca took the opportunity to remove him as the outfit's operational boss. Joseph Ayupa replaced him. When Giancana walked out in 1966, he had lost both his freedom and his position. He had spent a year in a cell and come out with nothing. He fled to Cuernavaca, Mexico, and stayed there for 8 years. From that distance, he tried to maintain whatever business interests he could,
running gambling operations in parts of Latin America and maintaining contact with outfit figures back in Chicago. What he did not do was share the profits from those foreign ventures with Accardo and the senior leadership. That failure to pay created resentment that compounded over time and never fully dissipated. In July 1974, Mexican authorities arrested him in his home wearing a bathrobe and slippers and deported him back to the United States without ceremony. He returned to Chicago in poor health, diminished, without real standing in the organization he had once led, and with a federal government that had not lost interest in him during his years abroad. He underwent gallbladder surgery in Houston in the spring of 1975. He was still recovering when the next problem arrived. The United States Senate had formed the Church Committee in January 1975 to investigate abuses by American intelligence agencies, including the CIA's foreign assassination programs. Giancana was subpoenaed to testify about his role in the Castro plots. Senate Intelligence Committee staffers arrived in Chicago on June 19, 1975, with plans to escort him to Washington the following morning. That evening, the police officers who had been stationed outside his house in Oak Park left the area shortly before 11 at night. Giancana hosted a small gathering at his home that evening. His daughter Francine and her family were there. Outfit associate Chucky English attended. His longtime personal driver and confidant, Dominic Blasi, known as Butch, was also present. The guests departed around 11. At some point after that, someone Giancana knew and trusted entered through the basement door of the house. Giancana was standing at the stove in the basement kitchen frying sausage. His back was to the door. The visitor shot him once in the back of the head. Then the shooter turned him over and fired 5 more rounds into his face and 1 round up under his chin. 7 shots total, from a silencer-equipped .22 caliber pistol. His caretaker, Joseph DiPerzio, found the body on the kitchen floor approximately 30 minutes later. Nothing in the house had been touched. Giancana had over $1,400 in cash on his person. The murder weapon, a .22 caliber high-standard pistol that had been shortened and fitted with a homemade silencer, was found 2 months later in a forest preserve off Thatcher Avenue in River Forest. The location was between Giancana's house and Tony Accardo's home. The FBI had Accardo's house under surveillance on the night of the murder. Their records documented one of his cars leaving the property before 11 and returning afterward. Mob associate Frank Calabrese Jr., whose father and uncle were senior outfit figures, later told investigators that his father had told him directly that Accardo had pulled the trigger himself. An FBI interview report obtained by NBC Chicago years later concluded that Accardo was involved in the killing. A separate theory, supported by Chicago crime historian John Binder, identifies Butch Blasi as the shooter. Blasi was the last confirmed person to see Giancana alive. A vehicle registered to Blasi or a member of his family was documented returning to Giancana's street after the other guests had already gone. Blasi was never charged. The timing of the murder was difficult to separate from what Giancana had been scheduled to do the next morning. He was going to Washington to testify before a Senate committee investigating CIA assassination programs. The testimony he could have given would have connected the United States government to organized crime in ways that both institutions had powerful reasons to keep buried. He was killed the night before he was supposed to talk. Johnny Rosselli, who had also been subpoenaed to testify before the Church Committee, and who had served as the primary intermediary between the CIA and the mob in the Castro plots, did not attend Giancana's funeral on June 23, 1975. Neither did Tony Accardo. Neither did any prominent figure from the Chicago outfit. About a year after Giancana was killed, Rosselli's decomposing body was found stuffed inside a 55-gallon oil drum floating off the coast of Miami. He had been strangled, stabbed, and his legs had been sawed off before the drum was sealed and dropped into the water. The Oak Park Police Department case file on the Giancana murder remained classified for decades because the investigation was never officially closed. The FBI confirmed as recently as 2025 that it considers the case an open and unsolved investigation. Nobody was ever charged, tried, or convicted. The man who had once run the most powerful mob organization in America, who had worked with the CIA to plot the assassination of a foreign head of state, who had eaten sausage in his kitchen while Senate investigators waited to take him to Washington, was buried without ceremony and without justice. The people who ordered or carried out his killing took the answer to that question with them, and the question has never been officially resolved. _quote_3__. The next case involves a murder that happened inside a busy hotel parking lot in broad daylight. A man shot 7 times while walking to lunch, with the entire Chicago mob world knowing exactly why it happened, but nobody ever saying a word to police. 5. Alan Dorfman, the mob's money man, 1983. Alan Dorfman was born on January 6, 1923, in Detroit, Michigan. He grew up in Chicago, enlisted in the United States Marines, and fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He was part of the assault on Iwo Jima and was awarded the Silver Star for his actions there. He came home, earned a university degree, and took a job as a physical education teacher, earning $4,000 a year. Nothing in that biography pointed toward what he would become, but the connection that would redirect everything had been present the entire time, sitting directly inside his own household. His stepfather was Paul Red Dorfman. Paul Dorfman ran the Chicago Waste Handlers Union and was embedded so deeply in the Chicago outfit that congressional investigators in 1959 described him as the essential link between the Teamsters Union and the Chicago underworld. He was a structural connector between two of the most powerful institutions in mid-century American organized crime. In 1949, Paul Dorfman struck a deal with Jimmy Hoffa, who was building himself into the dominant figure in the most powerful union in the United States. Paul offered Hoffa introductions, connections to the mob figures whose support Hoffa needed to consolidate control over the Teamsters. In exchange, Paul wanted one thing. He wanted his stepson Alan put into the Teamsters insurance business. Hoffa agreed. Alan Dorfman and his mother set up the Union Insurance Agency. They had no experience in insurance, no track record, no history in the industry. What they had was the deal Paul had made with Hoffa. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, the vast pool of retirement savings contributed by millions of truck drivers, needed someone to manage its insurance contracts. That business went to the Union Insurance Agency. Within 5 years, Alan Dorfman was a millionaire. The pension fund was the mechanism. As the fund grew and Hoffa's national power expanded through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Dorfman's position grew with it. He became the man whose approval was needed to move money out of the fund in the form of loans, and that position made him one of the most useful people in American organized crime. A Chicago outfit boss, recorded on an FBI wiretap, described the dynamic precisely. Alan was not that type of guy, but the people who had a piece of him were that type of guy. Alan was meek and harmless. The people behind him were not. Dorfman moved money, arranged deals, and kept his mouth shut. He was the mechanism, not the threat. When Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and sent to federal prison in 1967, he quietly arranged for Dorfman to take effective control of the Central States Pension Fund. By 1974, the fund had approved roughly $1 billion worth of loans. A significant portion went to mob-connected casino projects in Las Vegas. The most significant single transaction was a $63 million loan extended to a 32-year-old California real estate investor named Alan Glick, Glick used the money to purchase the Stardust and Fremont hotels in Las Vegas. The loan had not been made because anyone believed Glick was a sound investment risk. It had been made because the Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland organized crime families needed a frontman to hold legal ownership of those properties while they ran the actual operations. The man installed to run day-to-day operations was Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, a sports handicapper with deep ties to the Chicago outfit. Under his oversight, the casinos ran a systematic skimming operation. Cash removed from the counting rooms before official tallies were recorded, flowing back to the mob families whose loans had made the arrangement possible. Federal investigators later estimated the total amount skimmed at roughly $300 million. Alan Dorfman's loans had opened the door. His legal troubles began accumulating in the 1970s. He was convicted of accepting a $55,000 kickback on a pension fund loan and served 9 months in federal prison. He came out and continued operating. The arrangement Paul Dorfman had constructed in 1949 was still generating returns nearly 30 years later. Then in 1979, the FBI launched Operation Pendorf, a contraction of Penetrate Dorfman. Agents installed hidden microphones inside the offices of his insurance agency. What came back on those recordings was not ambiguous. Dorfman and his associates spoke about their schemes openly, in their own words, inside an office they believed was private. In May 1981, a federal grand jury returned indictments. Dorfman was charged alongside Teamsters president Roy Williams, Chicago outfit figure Joseph Lombardo, and 2 additional defendants. The charge was conspiracy to bribe a United States senator, Howard Cannon of Nevada, who sat on the Senate Commerce Committee. The Teamsters had a direct interest in blocking a trucking deregulation bill. The plan, captured on FBI recordings, was to offer Cannon Las Vegas real estate at substantially below market value. In exchange, he would use his position to stall or kill the deregulation bill. Cannon never accepted the deal, but the conspiracy to offer the bribe had been committed on tape, and that left very little room for the defense to maneuver. On December 15, 1982, after an 8-week trial, the jury convicted Dorfman along with Williams and Lombardo. He was 60 years old. The maximum sentence he faced was 55 years in federal prison. His sentencing was scheduled for February 10, 1983. The FBI confirmed publicly that Dorfman had not agreed to cooperate with the government. But the people who needed to assess the risk he represented did not operate on the basis of what he had done so far. They operated on the basis of what he might do once the reality of his situation became fully clear to him. Dorfman was 60 years old, facing 55 years. He had connections that spanned 3 decades of organized crime activity: the pension fund loans, the casino skimming operations, the political corruption arrangements, the names and roles of the people involved in all of it. If he decided that cooperation was preferable to a cell, what he could offer federal prosecutors was substantial enough to cause serious damage to a very large number of people. The mob did not wait to find out what he would decide. On Thursday, January 20th, 1983, 3 weeks after his conviction and 3 weeks before his sentencing, Dorfman drove to a bank in Lincolnwood with his longtime associate Erwin Weiner. They completed their transaction and walked out. As they moved between 2 parked cars in the hotel parking lot next door, 2 men came up from behind. One shouted that it was a stick-up. Then he immediately opened fire. No pause, no demand for valuables. Dorfman was shot 7 times in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. He died between the parked cars. Erwin Weiner, standing directly beside him and close enough to have been hit without the gunman taking a single additional step, was not touched. The shooter did not acknowledge him in any way. The FBI's Chicago office director stated publicly that this was not a robbery. It was a premeditated murder. Patrick Healy of the Chicago Crime Commission told reporters the purpose was to keep Dorfman quiet before he could testify or make a deal.
Reporter John Drummond, who had covered organized crime in Chicago for years, described the calculation directly. Allen, at 60 years of age, could not take hard time anymore. He was going to talk. So something had to be done about it. The shooting had occurred in a busy hotel parking lot in the middle of the day, exactly the kind of location the Chicago outfit typically avoided. Drummond said years later this suggested someone had tipped off the mob about Dorfman's movements that day. They had not had the luxury of waiting for a better opportunity. The sentencing date was approaching. They took the risk because they had no alternative. Erwin Weiner was not an innocent bystander. He was a bail bondsman with extensive ties to organized crime figures in Chicago. He had driven with Dorfman to the bank that morning. He had walked beside him across the parking lot. He had been left completely alone while the man next to him was shot 7 times. Investigators believed Weiner had provided the information about Dorfman's movements that allowed the hit team to be in position. Weiner was taken in for questioning and held for several hours after the shooting. He was never charged. He died in 1996. At least 4 witnesses were present in the parking lot. A nationwide FBI alert was issued. No arrests were made. The gunmen were described as white males and were never identified. Roy Williams, convicted alongside Dorfman in the Cannon bribery case, eventually cooperated with federal authorities. His testimony provided significant information about the relationship between the Teamsters and organized crime. What Dorfman might have added, given the depth of his involvement and the length of his tenure, was something the mob calculated it could not afford to find out. The story of what had been done with workers' retirement savings, the systematic diversion of pension fund contributions into mob-controlled casino loans and kickback arrangements, while the truck drivers whose money it was had no knowledge of any of it, was one of the most sustained financial crimes of the 20th century. It had been possible because of the deal struck in 1949 between Paul Dorfman and Jimmy Hoffa, and it had continued because Alan Dorfman understood how to operate at the boundary between legitimate financial administration and organized crime without ever making himself too visible to survive. The second conviction was different. 55 years at 60 years old was a sentence that could not be served and survived. That arithmetic was what killed him. He was shot on January 20th, 1983. He was scheduled for sentencing on February 10th. The Chicago outfit closed that gap 21 days early in a hotel parking lot in Lincolnwood in the middle of the day, in front of witnesses, because they had no better option and they had run out of time. The case has never been officially solved. No one was ever charged, tried, or convicted for his murder. The file remains open. _quote_4__. Up next is a mob massacre so brazen and so public that 7 men were lined up and executed in broad daylight. And despite a crime scene full of evidence and suspects who were known to police, not a single person was ever prosecuted for it. 6. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 dead, 1929. By the late 1920s, Chicago was split between 2 criminal empires. On the south side, Al Capone ran the Chicago outfit, controlling bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution across most of the city. On the north side, an Irish-German gang led by George Bugs Moran controlled a competing bootlegging operation that remained the last serious obstacle to Capone's total dominance. The 2 organizations had been trying to kill each other for years, accumulating a body count that had become almost routine in the city's newspapers. But what happened on February 14, 1929, was something different. It was an act of violence so extreme in its scale and so deliberate in its staging that it stopped being just another chapter in a gang war and became something permanent in American history.
The conflict traced back to the death of Northside boss Dion O'Banion in 1924, shot dead in his flower shop by men believed to be working for Johnny Torrio, Capone's predecessor. The Northsiders retaliated. Torrio himself was shot and seriously wounded in January 1925, survived, and retired to Italy, leaving Capone in charge. The cycle continued under Capone and under the North Side bosses who succeeded O'Banion. First, Jaime Weiss, then Moran after Weiss was killed in 1926. By early 1929, Moran's organization was diminished, but still functional. The Gusenberg brothers, Frank and Pete, were the enforcement corps of what remained. In January 1929, they walked into a Chicago hotel and opened fire on Jack McGurn, Capone's primary enforcer. McGurn survived. The attempt was a direct challenge, and in the logic of gang warfare, it demanded a response that would end the challenge permanently. What took shape over the following weeks was a plan designed not just to kill Moran, but to destroy the North Side gang in a single operation. Someone with connections to Detroit's Purple Gang contacted Moran with an offer: a truckload of hijacked Canadian whiskey available at a price well below market value. Moran was told to have his men at the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street on the morning of February 14th. The garage was a familiar gathering point for his crew. The offer was credible. There was no reason to be suspicious. Moran himself was expected to be there. Before dawn, lookouts positioned themselves in an apartment directly across the street. Their assignment was to watch for Moran's arrival and signal the team when he walked in. What happened with those lookouts and the single error they made would determine who survived that morning. Inside the garage by around 10 were 7 men. Frank and Pete Gusenberg were there, the same brothers who had tried to kill McGurn weeks earlier. Albert Kachalek, who went by the name James Clark, was Moran's second-in-command and his brother-in-law. Adam Heyer was the gang's bookkeeper. Albert Weinshank managed several businesses connected to the gang. John May, a mechanic, was there with his German Shepherd Highball tied to the bumper of one of the cars. And Reinhard Schwimmer was there, a former optician with no criminal background who had attached himself to the gang's social world simply because he found it exciting. He was not a gangster. That preference cost him his life. At around 10:30, a black Cadillac of the same model used by the Chicago Police Department pulled up outside. 4 men climbed out, 2 in police uniforms, 2 in civilian clothes. They walked into the garage with the authority of men conducting a raid. Moran's men understood what a police visit meant: a corrupt shakedown. Officers would come in, make a show of it, collect a payment, and leave. It had worked that way many times before. The 7 men did exactly what experienced criminals do during a routine corrupt raid. They lined up along the back wall facing the brick, hands raised, making no trouble. The 2 men in civilian clothes reached under their overcoats and pulled out Thompson submachine guns. The men in police uniforms produced additional weapons. They opened fire. 70 rounds were discharged from the Thompson guns. 1 shotgun shell was fired. 6 of the 7 men died against that wall almost immediately, their bodies in a rough line. The arrangement of men who had been standing together when the firing started. Frank Gusenberg, hit by 14 separate bullets, did not die instantly. He crawled approximately 20 feet across the garage floor before he stopped moving. John May's dog Highball was unharmed. Witnesses outside reported hearing the animal howling in the aftermath. When the shooting was done, the 2 men in civilian clothes put their weapons away. The 2 in police uniforms took positions on either side, as though escorting prisoners. They walked out and got into the Cadillac. To anyone watching from the street, it looked like a police unit leaving after a standard raid. Bugs Moran never walked into the garage that morning. He had arrived late. Approaching the building with 2 associates, he saw the black Cadillac and men in police uniforms entering his garage. He read the situation exactly as his men inside had: a raid. and kept walking in the other direction. He had no idea his men were already dead. The lookout had made a single critical mistake. Albert Weinshank, who shared Moran's approximate build and was wearing similar clothing, had been misidentified as the gang boss when he arrived. The signal was given too early. Moran was still outside when the shooting began. When real Chicago police officers arrived minutes later, they found 6 bodies and 1 man still alive. Sergeant Clarence Sweeney reached Frank Gusenberg while he could still speak and asked who had shot him. Gusenberg answered, "Nobody. Nobody shot me." He died 3 hours later, having never changed that answer. A man dying from 14 bullet wounds, declining to name his killers. Moran, reached by investigators later that day, was immediate and specific in his response. "Only Capone kills like that," he said. Capone was in Palm Beach, Florida. He had been there for days, with documentation confirming his presence. The alibi held completely. The investigation moved quickly toward Jack McGurn. The motive was direct. The Gusenbergs had tried to kill him weeks earlier, and now they were dead. McGurn was indicted in mid-March 1929. Before the trial could proceed, Capone had his associate John Scalise killed, eliminating a potential prosecution witness. McGurn's own case was eventually dropped. His girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, provided him with an alibi. McGurn then married Rolfe, which meant she could not be compelled to testify against him as his spouse. One significant piece of evidence came from an unlikely direction. A truck driver named Elmer Lewis told investigators he had attempted to swipe a car parked near the garage shortly before the massacre and had been waved off by the driver, who was missing a front tooth. That detail pointed to Fred Burke, a former member of St. Louis's Egan's Rats gang, who had become a Capone associate. Burke vanished immediately after the massacre. 10 months later, on December 14, 1929, Burke crashed his car in St. Joseph, Michigan, and shot and killed a police officer named Charles Scalise while trying to escape. He went into hiding under a false name and was not located until March 1931. When investigators searched his Michigan home after the car crash, they found a weapons cache that included 2 Thompson submachine guns. A forensic ballistics expert named Calvin Goddard tested those weapons against bullet casings recovered from the garage floor on February 14th. The testing confirmed the 2 Thompsons found in Burke's home were the same weapons fired in the garage, among the earliest applications of scientific ballistics analysis to solve a violent crime in American history. Burke was convicted in Michigan for the murder of Officer Scalise and sentenced to life in prison. He was never charged with any of the 7 deaths on North Clark Street. He died of a heart attack in custody in 1940. Capone continued operating until his conviction for federal tax evasion in October 1931, a charge that had nothing to do with the massacre. He served his sentence, was released in 1939 in deteriorating health, and died of a stroke in his Palm Beach home in January 1947. He was never questioned, charged, or prosecuted in connection with the 7 deaths on North Clark Street. McGurn survived the immediate legal jeopardy, but not the longer arc of what the massacre set in motion. His usefulness to the outfit declined through the early 1930s. On February 15, 1936, exactly 7 years and 1 day after the massacre, McGurn was shot to death in a Chicago bowling alley. He was found with a novelty telegram referencing the anniversary. The killers were never identified. Moran outlived the massacre by more than 2 decades, but never recovered his power. The North Side Gang was effectively destroyed on February 14, 1929. Moran drifted through minor criminal activity for years, was convicted of bank robbery in 1946, and served 10 years in federal prison. He died of lung cancer in a federal medical facility in Springfield, Missouri, on February 25, 1957. He had no money. He was buried in a prison cemetery.
The 2 Thompson submachine guns recovered from Burke's Michigan home still exist, held by the Berrien County Sheriff's Department in southwest Michigan. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street stood for nearly 4 decades before being demolished in 1967. The bricks from the back wall, the wall the 7 men were lined up against, were salvaged during the demolition. They are currently on display at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. No one was ever charged, tried, or convicted for the 7 deaths at 2122 North Clark Street. The case is officially unsolved and has never been formally closed. Up next is a case from 1978 in Boston, where 5 people were found murdered in a locked pub in the middle of the night, with drugs, mob connections, and a code of silence so thick that nearly 50 years later, nobody has ever been charged. 7. The Blackfriars Massacre, Boston, 1978. The Blackfriars Pub sat at 105 Summer Street in downtown Boston, in a 5-story office building near South Station. It opened as an Irish-themed bar and restaurant, and later added a disco on the lower floor, drawing office workers, local businessmen, and people connected to organized crime. It was the kind of place that existed in a particular register of Boston nightlife in the late 1970s, comfortable and familiar enough to attract civilians, but embedded deeply enough in the city's criminal ecosystem that the 2 worlds overlapped inside it on any given evening without much friction. Boston in 1978 was a city with an unusual relationship to organized crime. The Winter Hill Gang controlled Irish-American criminal operations across the city. The Patriarca crime family handled the Italian side. Both organizations had roots deep inside local law enforcement, built over decades of corruption that had become so normalized it was practically structural. The arrangement that made the city genuinely different from other mob towns, however, was the one involving Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi. Both men were simultaneously running the Winter Hill Gang as its operational leaders and serving as top-echelon FBI informants, providing the Bureau with intelligence on their rivals, while receiving in exchange a layer of protection that made prosecuting anyone in their orbit close to impossible. The FBI agent who managed that relationship was John Connolly, assigned to the Organized Crime Squad, whose loyalty to Bulger would eventually cost him his career and his freedom, but who in 1978 was one of the most influential figures in how organized crime was policed in the city. The pub's owner was Vincent Somonte, 35 years old, and a resident of Quincy, who investigators later confirmed was a close associate of Stephen Flemmi. The pub's night manager was John Jack Kelly, 34, a former radio and television journalist who had worked as an investigative reporter for WBZ Radio and Channel 7 News in Boston. Kelly had built a career reporting on crime and politics before being fired over a political scandal that ended his journalism work. He was trying to rebuild when he landed at the Blackfriars. His friend Maurice Lewis later told reporters that Kelly had been drawn to mob figures since his earliest days in journalism, cultivating criminal contacts with the enthusiasm of someone who found that world genuinely compelling rather than professionally useful. That attraction had followed him out of the newsroom and into the bar where he worked nights. By June 1978, the Blackfriars was not simply a bar doing legitimate business. 4 to 5 kilograms of cocaine and a substantial amount of cash were being kept on the premises. The pub had become a node in the drug distribution network that ran through the criminal organizations connected to Solmonte and Flemmi, and the drugs and money sitting in its basement office on any given night represented the kind of haul that attracted serious attention from people willing to do serious things to get it. On the evening of June 27, 1978, Flemmi visited the Blackfriars with his girlfriend, Marilyn De Silva. At some point during the evening, he spotted a Winter Hill Gang associate named Nick Femia inside the bar. Something about what Flemmi saw or understood in that moment made him move immediately.
He told De Silva they were leaving. She later told reporters that something in his voice made her understand there was no room for discussion. They left together.
Fleming knew something about what was coming, or knew enough to understand that whatever was about to happen was not something he wanted to be present for. By the early hours of June 28, 1978, the bar had closed and the customers had gone. 5 men remained inside the basement office. Solmonte, the owner, was there. Kelly, the manager, was there. Peter Marath, 31, of Jamaica Plain, was there. Charles McGarrion, 36, of North Andover, was there. Freddie De La Vega, 34, of Somerville, was there. They were playing backgammon, using cocaine, and in no apparent hurry to leave. According to author Howie Carr, whose account drew on criminal debriefings and court records, a group of gunmen entered the building through the cellar. The plan, as it had been conceived, was a robbery. The drugs and the cash were the target. The men in the basement office were supposed to be relieved of what was there and left alive. The plan did not include murder. Then Kelly looked up and recognized one of the gunmen. Kelly had spent years cultivating relationships with people from exactly this world. He had met criminals through his journalism work, maintained those contacts after he left journalism, and worked in a bar that served as a gathering point for people connected to organized crime. He knew faces. He knew names. When one of the men standing in front of him with a weapon was someone he recognized, he said something. The accounts vary on the exact words, but the substance was a question of recognition directed at the gunman. Something to the effect of, "Is that you?" That question ended any possibility the 5 men in that basement had of surviving the night. The gunmen shot all 5 men in the head. A law enforcement official who was among the first to arrive at the scene told reporters there was blood all over the place. The first thing he thought of, he said, was the Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago. That comparison was not made lightly. The scene in the basement of the Blackfriars was one of the worst crime scenes investigators in Boston had encountered. The bar's janitor, Jerry Robinson, arrived shortly after 7 in the morning to clean the office. He found the bodies. He called the Boston Globe immediately after calling the police. Suffolk County District Attorney Garrett Byrne, who had spent decades in law enforcement, told reporters he had never witnessed a more shocking crime in his career. Jack Kelly had left behind a wife and 4 young children. Investigators working the scene found $15,000 in cash sitting in an unlocked safe. Significant amounts of cocaine and marijuana were also present. The full value of what had been taken from the premises was never formally established, but sources told investigators that the cocaine was on the street for sale within hours of the killings. Its street value estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The people who had carried out the massacre had gotten what they came for and moved it immediately. Boston police identified several suspects. The primary names in the investigation were Whitey Bulger, Stephen Fleming, Nick Femia, Robert Italiano of Revere, and William Ierardi of Lynn. On July 12, 1978, 14 days after the killings, police arrested Italiano and Ierardi and charged them with all 5 murders. The 2 men were the prosecution's theory of the case made concrete, the names attached to the gunmen who had entered through the cellar. At trial, a witness testified that the plan to rob the Blackfriars had been tipped to Ierardi by Miles Connor, a notorious art thief with an extensive criminal history, who allegedly told Ierardi that a significant cocaine deal would be taking place at the pub that night. Connor denied having ever spoken to Ierardi about the Blackfriars or anything else connected to the robbery. Prosecutors argued to the jury that the massacre had not been planned as a murder. The theory was that one of the victims had moved suddenly during the robbery, the armed men had panicked in response, and the shooting had started in that moment of instability and killed everyone present. It was a theory that reduced 5 deliberate executions to the consequences of a panicked reaction, and it was a theory the jury examined for approximately 7 hours before rejecting it entirely. On April 9, 1979, the jury returned not guilty verdicts on all counts. Both Italiano and Ierardi walked out of the Charles Street Jail free men. Outside the building, Italiano told reporters he was innocent and was going home to rest for a while. The acquittal did not close the investigation. It reopened the question of who had actually done it. The presence of John Connolly in the background of the case created complications that extended well beyond the immediate investigation. Connolly had been working the organized crime squad and had been actively investigating Solmonte and the Blackfriars before the killings. After Bulger and Nick Femia had a falling out, Connolly placed a report in Bulger's FBI informant file suggesting that Femia had been one of the triggermen at the Blackfriars. That report was never substantiated by any independent evidence. Its placement in the file, given what later became known about Connolly's relationship with Bulger, raised serious questions about whether it was an accurate intelligence assessment or a piece of paperwork designed to damage a man Bulger wanted discredited. Connolly's corruption eventually caught up with him. He was convicted in Massachusetts for his role as an FBI informant to Bulger in connection with a 1982 murder, serving time for that. He was subsequently tried and convicted in Florida in connection with a 1982 murder ordered by Bulger, receiving a 40-year sentence. The agent who had protected Bulger and Flemmi for years, who had fed them information about investigations and helped neutralize threats to their operation, ended his career in a Florida prison. A retired FBI agent later testified in court that Ierardi had admitted to investigators that he had fabricated the involvement of Bulger and Flemmi in the Blackfriars massacre. If that account was accurate, the two most powerful names in Boston organized crime had been inserted into the narrative of the case by someone with a motive to put them there, not because the evidence pointed to them. What that meant for the actual identity of the people who had walked into the basement that night was a question that remained open. Nick Femia, whose presence in the bar on the evening before the killings had alarmed Flemmi enough to make him leave immediately, was never charged in connection with the massacre. He continued operating in Boston's criminal underworld for 5 more years. In December 1983, he was shot and killed during what was described as the unsuccessful attempted shakedown of an auto body shop in East Boston. He was 43 years old. The shop owner who shot him was not charged. Whatever Femia knew about the Blackfriars, whatever role he had played in it, or knowledge he carried about the people who had, died with him in that East Boston parking lot. Flemmi himself was eventually arrested and convicted on a range of charges that included murder. The cooperation arrangement he had maintained with the FBI for decades collapsed when the full extent of his criminal activity became clear to prosecutors who were no longer willing to overlook it. He pleaded guilty to 10 murders and received a life sentence. The Blackfriars killings were not among the charges he was convicted of. Bulger fled Boston in 1994 ahead of a federal indictment, tipped off by Connolly. He disappeared into a fugitive life that lasted 16 years before he was found living in Santa Monica, California in 2011 under a false name. He was convicted in 2013 on 31 counts, including 11 murders. The Blackfriars killings were not among the charges. He was 73 years old when the verdict was returned. In October 2018, Bulger was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Hazleton in West Virginia. Within 12 hours of his arrival, he was beaten to death in his cell. He was 89 years old. His killers, who used a padlock and a sock, were never charged with his murder. The building at 105 Summer Street still stands. The basement, where 5 men were shot in the head during a robbery that was not supposed to involve any killing, has long since been converted to other uses. The Blackfriars pub has been closed for decades. The space that once housed it is occupied by a Dunkin' Donuts and a GNC store. The case is officially open and unsolved. Nobody has ever been convicted of the 5 murders committed at the Blackfriars pub on June 28, 1978. The question of who walked through that cellar door
and which specific person Kelly recognized when he looked up has never been formally answered in a court of law. Up next is a case from 1980, where a man drove home from work, accidentally hit and killed a mob boss's 12-year-old son, and then vanished off the face of the earth. A murder that was never officially confirmed, but that everyone knew had happened. 8. John Favara, Gotti's neighbor, 1980. John Favara was born on March 4, 1929. He lived in Howard Beach, a working-class neighborhood in Queens, New York, in a modest house that backed directly onto the yard of his neighbor, John Gotti. Favara was not a criminal. He worked as a service department manager at Castro Convertibles, a furniture company in New Hyde Park on Long Island. He went to work, came home, and lived the kind of unremarkable life that in most circumstances would have insulated him entirely from what eventually happened to him. His adopted son, Scott, was friends with the Gotti children and had stayed at their house for sleepovers. Favara had a childhood friend named Ettore Zappi, who had become a captain in the Gambino crime family. But that connection had produced nothing in Favara's own life. He stayed out of that world. He had no criminal record, no criminal associations, no involvement in anything that would have made him a person of interest to anyone in organized crime. His neighbor was a different matter entirely. By early 1980, John Gotti was a captain in the Gambino crime family, the largest and most powerful of New York's 5 families. He ran the Bergen crew out of Queens and had become one of the family's most productive earners through loan sharking, hijacking, and narcotics trafficking. He had served time in federal prison in the early 1970s after pleading guilty to attempted manslaughter, and had been back on the street since 1977, rebuilding his position and extending his reach. He was known within the Gambino hierarchy as someone who combined genuine street intelligence with a personal fearlessness that made him effective and, in the right circumstances, dangerous to manage. He had 5 children. His middle son, Frank, was born in 1968, and by the accounts of people who knew the family, Frank was the child Gotti was closest to. On the afternoon of March 18, 1980, Frank Gotti was 12 years old. He borrowed a motorized minibike from a friend in the neighborhood. The friend had not yet finished explaining how to operate the machine when Frank took off into the street. John Favara was driving home from work. The sun was low in the sky and coming directly through his windshield. A construction dumpster parked on the street created a blind spot at the precise point where Frank entered the road from between parked vehicles. Favara hit the boy. In the immediate shock of the collision, he was not fully aware of what had happened and kept driving. The minibike and the child were dragged approximately 200 feet before neighbors who had witnessed the impact began screaming, running into the street, and beating on the hood of his car. He stopped. Frank was taken to the hospital and declared dead. The police investigated. They ruled the death an accident. No criminal charges were filed against Favara. The physical circumstances of the collision supported the determination at every point. The blind spot created by the dumpster was real and documentable. The angle and position of the sun at that time of afternoon were real. Frank had taken the minibike before receiving operating instructions and had gone directly into traffic without warning. The investigation found nothing to contradict the conclusion that what had happened was a tragic accident caused by a convergence of circumstances that no single person had created or could have prevented. In the Gotti household, no ruling changed what had happened to Frank. The months that followed were a sustained and escalating nightmare for John Favara. Someone spray-painted the word "murderer" across his car in letters large enough to read from a distance. His vehicle was later stolen. Anonymous death threats arrived by phone and by letter. Someone placed a photograph of Frank Gotti directly in his mailbox,
an act designed to communicate something specific about who was doing it and why.
On May 28, 1980, Victoria Gotti, Frank's mother, attacked Favara with a metal baseball bat outside his house. She hit him with it. Favara did not call the police and did not press charges. He also made the mistake, at some point during this period, of attempting to visit the Gotti home to offer his condolences and apologize in person for what had happened. The attempt made things considerably worse. People who knew the neighborhood, who understood what living next door to John Gotti meant in practical terms, told Favara repeatedly and urgently that he needed to leave Howard Beach. He knew who Gotti was. He understood what the threats and the vandalism and the baseball bat represented. He put his house on the market, found a buyer, and began the process of extracting himself from the situation he had been placed in through no fault of his own. The sale was expected to close on July 31, 1980. 3 days before the closing date, on July 25th,
The entire Gotti family left Howard Beach for a vacation in Florida. On July 28, 1980, 3 days into that vacation, and 3 days before the house sale would have completed and John Favara would have left the neighborhood permanently, Favara finished his shift at Castro Convertibles and walked toward his car. Near his workplace, a group of men confronted him. Witnesses in the area observed what happened next. Favara was struck in the head. He was shoved into a van. The van drove away. That was the last time anyone saw John Favara alive. The Gotti family returned from Florida on August 4th. Detectives were waiting. Both John and Victoria Gotti were questioned about Favara's disappearance. Gotti's response to the investigators was direct and unambiguous. He told them he was not sorry the man was missing and would not be sorry if he turned up dead. Victoria told the detectives she did not know what had happened to him, but was not disappointed he was gone, because he had killed her boy. Both pointed to the Florida trip as confirmation that neither of them had been present in New York when Favara disappeared. No charges were filed. The alibi was structurally sound in the narrow sense that Gotti had been documented in Florida when the abduction occurred. But the question of who had ordered it and who had carried it out was separate from the question of where Gotti himself had been standing. That distinction was understood by everyone involved in the investigation and changed nothing about the outcome of it. For years, the question of what had been done with Favara's body remained unanswered. A theory circulated through the following decades that his remains had been placed in a barrel of concrete and dropped off a pier at Sheepshead Bay. The theory was specific enough to suggest it had come from someone with genuine knowledge of what had happened, but it produced no body and no evidence. Then, in January 2009, federal prosecutors filed a 44-page evidence motion in a Brooklyn racketeering case against Gambino family hitman Charles Carneglia. The motion was signed by Assistant United States Attorney Roger Burlingame. It alleged that Carneglia had killed John Favara on Gotti's orders and had dissolved the body in acid. Carneglia was described in the document as part of a 7-member Gambino hit squad. The Favara killing was listed among a series of uncharged crimes included in the motion to establish the pattern of Carneglia's conduct. The allegation about acid was not new within law enforcement circles, but its appearance in a formal federal court filing gave it a different kind of official weight. If the account was accurate, there was no body to find, because the body had been chemically destroyed. That would explain why decades of investigation had produced nothing recoverable, and why the theory about Sheepshead Bay, specific as it was, had never led anywhere physical. Carneglia pleaded not guilty to the charges brought against him. He was convicted in 2009 on 5 counts of murder. The Favara killing was not among the formal charges he faced. It appeared in the evidence motion as context, as part of the pattern of conduct the government wanted the court to understand. It was never prosecuted as a standalone case, and no conviction was obtained in connection with Favara's death. In November 2004,
FBI informants had led investigators to excavate a parking lot in New York City that was believed to be a mob burial site. 2 bodies were recovered. Favara was not among them. He was declared legally dead in 1983, 3 years after his disappearance. His wife Janet and his 2 sons moved out of Howard Beach after he vanished. The family he had left behind moved on as best they could from a situation that had produced no resolution, no remains, no justice, and no formal accounting of what had been done or by whose specific hand. John Gotti's life after the death of Frank and the disappearance of Favara continued on its existing trajectory and then accelerated dramatically. In December 1985, he orchestrated the assassination of Gambino family boss Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, one of the most audacious mob killings in the history of New York organized crime. Castellano was shot 6 times as he stepped out of his car on East 46th Street. Gotti took over the Gambino family and became one of the most publicly prominent mob bosses in American history, a figure who cultivated media attention rather than avoided it, and became known as the Dapper Don for the expensive suits and confident manner he maintained through multiple federal prosecutions. 3 separate trials had produced acquittals, a record that earned him a second nickname, the Teflon Don, a reference to the prosecution's apparent inability to make charges stick. The acquittals owed something to jury tampering, and something to witness intimidation, and something to the skills of his defense attorneys. The 4th federal prosecution was different. Gotti's own underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, agreed to cooperate with the government and provided testimony about the inner workings of the Gambino family that prosecutors had been trying to obtain for years. Gravano had participated in 19 murders and received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on 13 criminal counts, including murder and racketeering, and sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He never left custody. He died on June 10, 2002, from complications related to head and neck cancer that had been diagnosed and treated during his imprisonment. He was 61 years old. He is buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, next to his son Frank, the 12-year-old boy whose death on a borrowed minibike on a March afternoon in 1980 had set in motion everything that followed for John Favara. No one has ever been charged with the murder of John Favara. No body was ever recovered. The disappearance is officially unsolved. A man who went to work every day at a furniture company, who was ruled by police to have been involved in a tragic accident rather than a crime, who put his house on the market and found a buyer and was 3 days from closing the sale and leaving the neighborhood forever, was struck in the head and pushed into a van on July 28, 1980, and was never seen again. The case has never been formally closed. The next case involves a mob boss gunned down in the parking lot of a restaurant in broad daylight with dozens of witnesses nearby, and a city so deeply corrupt that not a single person was ever brought to justice for it. 9. Gus and Bess Greenbaum, The Double Murder, 1958. Gustav Gus Greenbaum was born in Chicago on February 26, 1893, the son of Jewish immigrant parents who had come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He grew up in that world of immigrant neighborhoods and early 20th century street commerce and found his way, as many young men from similar backgrounds did, toward the criminal networks that were expanding rapidly in the cities of the Northeast. By the 1910s, he was on New York's Lower East Side, working alongside Meyer Lansky in the emerging criminal infrastructure that would eventually become one of the most powerful organized crime coalitions in American history. He was part of that world from its foundational period, which meant he understood how it worked and what it demanded at a level that most people who joined it later never fully acquired. During Prohibition, he moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and went to work for the Chicago outfit. Starting in 1928, he ran the Southwest Division of the Transamerica Racewire Service from an office in the Lures Tower in downtown Phoenix. The wire service was the central nervous system of bookmaking operations across the country, feeding horse racing results to bookmakers in real time and making organized illegal gambling possible at a scale that required reliable, fast information delivery. Greenbaum built an extensive bookmaking network across Arizona and developed relationships with politicians and law enforcement that kept him largely insulated from prosecution for decades. He cultivated the appearance of a legitimate businessman. He was known around Phoenix as a successful, well-connected figure in the community. The illegal revenue flowing through his operation was substantial and essentially invisible to the legal system, because he had built the relationships necessary to keep it that way. After World War II ended, the Chicago outfit and its allied organizations turned serious attention toward Las Vegas, where Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931 and where the possibilities of a regulated casino environment were only beginning to be understood. Greenbaum was sent west to invest and operate. In 1945, he put money into the El Cortez Hotel and Casino alongside Mo Sedway and Morris Rosen, establishing a foothold in what was still a small desert town with enormous unrealized potential. Then Bugsy Siegel took over the Flamingo construction project, and things became complicated in ways that everyone connected to it would eventually feel. Siegel's management of the Flamingo had been catastrophic in financial terms. The construction budget had exploded from approximately $1.2 million to over $6 million. The opening on December 26, 1946, had been a disaster. The hotel section was unfinished, bad weather had kept Hollywood guests away, and the casino tables had lost money from the first night. Siegel closed the property in February 1947 and reopened it in March. By May 1947, it was showing a profit. But the mob's patience had already run out, and the allegation that Siegel and Virginia Hill had been moving construction money into Swiss bank accounts had circulated long enough to have hardened into a verdict. On the evening of June 20, 1947, Siegel was shot to death in the Beverly Hills house he had leased for Hill. Within minutes of the shooting, Greenbaum, Sedway, and Rosen walked into the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas and announced they were the new management. The coordination between the timing of the murder and the appearance of the replacement team in the lobby was not coincidental. The transition had been planned before the trigger was pulled. Greenbaum took charge of the property. What followed was one of the more impressive operational turnarounds in the early history of Las Vegas casino management. The Flamingo had been hemorrhaging money under Siegel's erratic oversight. Greenbaum understood casino operations at a level that Siegel, for all his energy and vision, had not. He ran it tightly, managed costs, brought in name entertainment for the showroom, and balanced the legitimate visible operation with the illicit financial structures that ran underneath it. In his first full year running the property, the Flamingo posted a profit of $4 million. He had taken a disaster and made it work. His reputation within Las Vegas in those years was significant. He had the nickname, the Mayor of Paradise, a reference to the unincorporated township that surrounded what was becoming the Las Vegas Strip. The title captured something real about his position. He knew the politicians, the law enforcement officials, the entertainers, and the criminals who constituted the social world of early Las Vegas. And he moved through all of those circles with equal comfort. He played golf with Barry Goldwater, who would become an Arizona senator and later a presidential candidate, and maintained the kind of social relationships with legitimate figures that served the useful function of normalizing his presence. When the Flamingo was sold for $9 million in 1954, Greenbaum reportedly collected roughly $4 million along with his mob partners. He was 61 years old. He had been working in the criminal underworld for 4 decades. He wanted to stop. He went back to Phoenix, where he had spent the years before Las Vegas, and tried to settle into retirement. He played golf. He spent time with friends. He attempted to reconstruct the quieter life he had stepped away from when the mob had sent him west a decade earlier. Then Tony Accardo called. Accardo was the boss of the Chicago outfit. the man who ran the most powerful mob organization in the country outside of New York. The Riviera Hotel had opened on April 20th, 1955, and within its first 3 months had fallen into serious financial trouble. It was losing money in ways that should not have been possible for a casino on the Las Vegas Strip in 1955, and the outfit needed someone who understood how to fix it. Accardo wanted Greenbaum. Greenbaum said no. He had retired. He had his money. He was done. He said no more than once. Then, in 1955, his sister-in-law Leone Greenbaum was found dead in her home. She had been murdered by suffocation. No suspects were ever arrested. No evidence was ever produced connecting anyone to her death. No investigation produced a result. The killing was clean in the sense that it left nothing for law enforcement to work with, and communicated everything to the one person it was intended to reach. Greenbaum took the job at the Riviera. The message delivered by Leone's death was not subtle and was not meant to be. It was a demonstration of capability and intent directed at a specific man for a specific purpose. If Greenbaum could be reached through the people around him in retirement in Phoenix, then retirement in Phoenix was not a refuge from anything. He understood what had happened and what it meant. He packed up his golf clubs and went back to work. The years at the Riviera were not like the years at the Flamingo. Greenbaum, in the late 1950s, was a different man from the sharp, controlled operator who had turned around the Flamingo in 1947 and 1948. He had been managing an addiction to opioids for years, the drugs originally prescribed for back pain, and then consumed in quantities that had long since escaped any medical purpose. He was drinking heavily. He was gambling compulsively, which, for a man running a casino, created obvious and compounding problems. He was conducting affairs openly, in ways that showed no concern for discretion or consequences. Most critically, he was stealing from the casino. The mob's operation in Las Vegas during this period was built around a carefully managed skim, cash removed from the counting rooms before official tallies were recorded, and sent back to the crime families in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland that had financed the properties. It was systematic, it was substantial, and it was the primary reason the mob had invested in Las Vegas in the first place. Greenbaum was now stealing from that operation. He was taking money that was supposed to go to Chicago and redirecting it to cover his own debts and fund his own habits. The outfit found out. Chicago enforcer Marshal Caifano reportedly came to the Riviera in 1958 and delivered a message to Greenbaum in terms that left no ambiguity. The message was that Greenbaum could sell out his position and leave, or he could be carried out of the building in a box. Caifano was not a man who made empty threats. He was one of the outfit's most feared enforcers, a man with a documented history of violence going back decades. Greenbaum received the message. In the weeks before his death, Greenbaum hired 2 bodyguards for the first time in his life. The fact that he had never previously felt the need for personal security, despite decades of operating at the center of organized crime in 2 states, indicated how clearly he understood the situation he was now in. He was seen walking with those bodyguards when he went to vote on November 4, 1958. Then he left Las Vegas and flew back to Phoenix. On the evening of December 2, 1958, Greenbaum's housekeeper, Pearl Ray, finished her work at the house on 1115 West Monte Vista Road, a ranch-style home in the upscale Encanto neighborhood of Phoenix. Bess Greenbaum, 64 years old and Gus's wife of many years, did what she did every evening. She gave Pearl a ride home. The drive was approximately 4 miles. While Bess was gone, someone entered the house. Police later found cigarette ashes and footprints near the garage, evidence that at least 1 or 2 people had waited outside the property while the housekeeper was still present. The side door to the house showed no signs of forced entry. It had likely been left unlocked. The people who came that night knew the house, knew the routine, and knew that Bess would be gone for a period of time after driving Pearl home. Gus was in the bedroom in his beige silk pajamas. The television was on. A heating pad was beside him. He was struck twice in the skull with severe blows. Then his throat was cut, nearly to the point of decapitation, with a 9-inch butcher knife taken from his own kitchen. Pillows were placed on either side of his head, presumably to contain the sound. When Bess returned from dropping Pearl off, she was attacked the moment she came through the door. She was struck in the head with a decorative glass bottle that was found beside her body. The blow fractured her skull. Her wrists were bound behind her back with a cheap necktie. A towel and newspaper were placed around her head. Then her throat was cut with the same butcher knife that had been used on Gus. She was found the following morning face down on a couch in the den, still wearing the clothes she had gone out in. Pearl Ray arrived for work on the morning of December 3rd and noticed something immediately wrong. Food from the freezer was sitting on the counter, left out from the previous evening. She pushed open the office door and found Bess. She ran to the neighbors and called the police. She was taken to hospital in shock and treated there. A law enforcement official who responded to the scene described it as vicious, brutal, and thorough. The Arizona Republic ran a photograph of Bess Greenbaum's bound body on its front page on December 4th. The New York Daily News ran the same image. The coverage was national and immediate. Police recognized the signature of the crime almost immediately. There was no evidence of forced entry at the point of access. Nothing inside the house had been searched. A ring had been taken from Gus's hand, and some cash was gone, but thousands of dollars worth of furs and jewelry had been left completely untouched throughout the property. The selective taking of small items while leaving obvious valuables behind was consistent with a killing staged to suggest robbery, while actually being an execution. Investigators were not confused about what they were looking at. 5 days before the murders, a secret gathering of mob figures had reportedly taken place at a ranch in Tucson owned by Detroit mob boss Pete Licavoli. The timing connected the meeting to the killings in ways that were suggestive, but produced no prosecutable evidence. Phoenix police developed a theory that the killers had flown in from Miami on the day of the murders and left immediately afterward, which would explain the absence of any local trail and the difficulty in identifying anyone connected to the scene. One name surfaced briefly: a man named Milner Jarvis, a former Flamingo hotel clerk who had been convicted in 1948 of stealing $45,000 from Greenbaum and had served a prison sentence for it, had recently been released and was spotted in Las Vegas approximately 2 weeks before the murders. The timing and the history created a connection that investigators followed, but there was no physical evidence placing him at the scene in Phoenix, and no charges were filed against him. The United States Justice Department convened a federal grand jury in Los Angeles to investigate the Greenbaum murders as part of a broader examination of organized crime activity in California and Arizona. Joseph Bonanno, the boss of one of New York's 5 families, and a figure with significant connections to Arizona, was subpoenaed to testify. The grand jury produced nothing. No arrest was ever made in connection with the murders of Gus and Bess Greenbaum. The case has remained officially unsolved since December 1958. Gus and Bess Greenbaum are buried at Beth Israel Cemetery in Phoenix, within a few feet of each other. Nearby is the grave of Leonie Greenbaum, the sister-in-law, whose suffocation murder 3 years earlier had been used as the instrument to force Gus back into the casino business against his will. The 3 of them ended up in the same cemetery, the deaths of all 3 connected by the same logic and the same organization, none of them ever producing a single arrest. The man who had helped build the Flamingo into a profitable operation, who had been present in the lobby minutes after Bugsy Siegel was shot, who had run 2 major Las Vegas casinos and helped construct the financial architecture of the mob's grip on the city, was found in his bedroom in silk pajamas with his throat cut because he had stolen from the people who had already demonstrated they could reach anyone he loved at any time they chose. The organization that killed him was never identified in court. The individuals who carried it out were never named in a formal charge. The case has no resolution and no end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case in this series involves a man with decades of dirty secrets about the Teamsters Union and the Las Vegas mob, shot 7 times in a parking lot 3 days before he was due to be sentenced to 55 years in prison, while the people who ordered his death went home and slept perfectly well. 10. Theodore Rowe, the Robin Hood of the South Side, 1952. Theodore Teddy Rowe was born on August 26, 1898, in Galliano, Louisiana, the son of Black American sharecroppers. His family later moved to Little Rock, Arkansas. He received no formal education as a child. He learned to sew by doing odd jobs for a tailor, then drifted into bootlegging, which was the entry point for many men of his generation who had limited access to legitimate economic advancement and no shortage of resourcefulness. He had a light complexion that allowed him to move through a segregated society with somewhat more freedom than most black men of his era, which was itself a form of capital in a world built on racial exclusion. After bootlegging ended with Prohibition's repeal, he worked briefly at an automobile plant in Detroit before landing in Chicago, where he went to work as a tailor for a man named Edward Jones on the South Side. That job was the pivot point of his entire life. Jones ran a numbers racket, an illegal lottery game called Policy that had been operating in Chicago's black neighborhoods for decades. The game was simple in structure. Players chose a series of numbers, placed small bets, and if their numbers matched the day's winning combination, they collected a multiple of their wager. The amounts bet per player were modest, usually pennies or small change, but the volume of players across the South Side made the aggregate revenue enormous. Under the protection of the Kelly Nash Democratic political machine that controlled Chicago's city government, Jones was generating $10,000 a day by 1938. The operation was tolerated, managed, and profitable, and it existed within a political ecosystem that had decided the policy game was more useful as a revenue source for its operators than as a target for prosecution. Rowe started at the bottom, working as a runner, collecting bets from players on the street. He was sharp, dependable, and genuinely fearless, and he moved up quickly through the operation. By the 1940s, he and Jones were equal partners in one of the largest policy operations on the South Side. From 1945 to 1950, their joint operation netted $4.9 million, employed 70 full-time staff, and used roughly 300 commission-based bet writers working the streets of the neighborhood. It was a serious business, run with the discipline and organizational attention of a serious business, and it made both men wealthy in a city and an era where wealth for Black Americans required navigating barriers that most white Americans never encountered at all. The policy game was not simply a criminal enterprise. In the context of the South Side in the mid-20th century, it functioned as a financial institution for a community that had been systematically excluded from legitimate ones. Segregation locked most Black Chicagoans out of banks, out of credit, out of the investment opportunities available to white citizens in the same city. Policy kings like Rowe operated in the gap that exclusion created. They built car dealerships, apartment buildings, department stores, and churches. They paid hospital bills for newborns whose families could not cover the cost. They covered funeral expenses for the dead. Rowe himself was known to hand cash directly to people who needed it, and to forgive debts owed to him by employees who had fallen behind. The neighborhood called him the Robin Hood of the South Side, and the name was not ironic. It reflected a genuine understanding of what he represented to the community he operated in and gave back to. The problem was that Sam Giancana had other plans. While serving time in an Illinois state prison in 1939, Giancana had shared a cell with Edward Jones. Jones talked openly and at length about the policy operation, how it worked, and how profitable it was. He had no particular reason to be guarded about it in the context of a prison cell conversation. He did not yet know what Giancana would do with the information. Giancana filed it carefully away. When he was released, he went to his superiors in the Chicago outfit and presented the case for taking over the South Side numbers business. He got their blessing. In May 1946, Giancana had Jones kidnapped in front of his wife. The ransom demand was set at $250,000. Rowe negotiated directly on Jones's behalf, working the number down to $100,000, and helped raise the money to secure his partner's release. After Jones came home, he and his brother George assessed the situation with the clarity of men who understood exactly what they were dealing with. They left for their estate in Mexico and did not return. They negotiated a settlement with the outfit that gave them $200,000 a year to stay out of Chicago and surrender their operation entirely. The men who had built the policy business on the South Side walked away from it because the alternative was staying and being killed. Rowe was now alone, and he refused to give up a single penny. Giancana sought a meeting. He came to it with a specific offer: $250,000 in cash for Rowe to walk away from the policy racket and leave it to the outfit. The offer was generous by any conventional measure. Rowe told him he would die first. Giancana reported back to his superiors that Rowe understood precisely what he was rejecting and was rejecting it anyway. Then the violence started. Rowe's house was bombed. His wife and children were shot at. His collectors were beaten in the street with systematic regularity. Dozens of other black bookmakers operating around the city were attacked with shotguns and clubs. Many of them made the rational decision to stop working and leave Chicago. Rowe stayed in his mansion on South Michigan Avenue and kept running his operation. He hired bodyguards. He varied his movements. He stayed armed. He did not move. On June 19, 1951, a four-man hit team led by an outfit soldier named Leonard Caifano, who was known as Fat Lenny, pulled over Rowe's car on a South Side street. They were posing as state attorney police, presenting the stop as a law enforcement action. Rowe was not a man who accepted things at face value. He demanded to see identification. When the men moved on him instead of producing it, Rowe pulled his own weapon and shot Caifano through the head. Caifano died instantly. A second man in the group was hit in the shoulder.
The other two fled.
The killing had immediate and serious implications beyond the immediate survival of Rowe. Leonard Caifano was not simply a soldier. He was a made man in the Chicago outfit, and the brother of Marshal Joseph Caifano, a senior outfit capo who was one of the most feared enforcers in Chicago. Killing a made man without authorization from the organization was one of the most fundamental violations of the code that governed mob conduct. The fact that Rowe had done it in self-defense against an unprovoked attack was not a consideration that the outfit's internal logic was equipped to accommodate. Chicago police arrested Rowe and charged him with murder. He was denied bail 6 times during the proceedings, meaning he remained in custody for the duration. The threat to his life inside the system was taken seriously enough that jail authorities prepared his meals outside the prison, specifically because of concerns that the outfit would attempt to poison him through someone inside the facility. His defense team worked the case aggressively and successfully linked prosecutors to organized crime figures, causing key evidence against him to be thrown out. Rowe presented a self-defense argument, arguing that the 4 men had been attempting to kidnap him when he fired. The jury heard the case and acquitted him. When he walked out of the courthouse, he told reporters that they would have to kill him to take what he had built. The statement turned out to be prophetic in a way he may not have intended it. On August 1, 1952, A doctor told Rowe he had incurable stomach cancer. The diagnosis was a death sentence, delivered on a medical timeline rather than an organized crime one. Something in Rowe shifted. He had spent more than a year living under an armed guard, largely confined to his home, unable to move freely through the neighborhood he had built his life in. He had survived bombings and shootings and a murder trial and a kidnapping attempt. He had done it by staying alert and staying protected and refusing to give an inch. Now, his own body had told him the story would end regardless. He dismissed his bodyguards. On the evening of August 4th, 1952, 3 days after the diagnosis,
Rowe dressed in a three-piece suit and hat and went outside. He sat on the stoop in front of his home at 5239 South Michigan Avenue in the warm summer evening. He was a man who had spent years fighting to stay alive, and now he had decided, apparently, to stop treating survival as the primary obligation of every waking hour. At around 10 in the evening, hitmen parked near the property opened fire. 5 blasts from 12-gauge shotguns struck him in the back, the jaw, and the face. He never had time to reach for his revolver. He died without drawing it. His wife, Carrie, heard the shots from inside the house and called out his name. She received no answer. She went outside and found him. No witnesses came forward. No one was ever charged. In the immediate aftermath, Chicago police arrested 15 men for questioning. The list included Anthony Accardo, Sam Giancana, Marshall Caifano, and several other senior outfit figures. All of them were released. The connections between the men on that list and the murder of Teddy Rowe were not obscure or difficult to understand. The history was documented. The motive was explicit and had been explicit for 6 years. The organization that had bombed his house, shot at his family, beaten his collectors, and sent a 4-man team to kidnap him on a public street in broad daylight was the same organization run by the men police brought in for questioning. None of it produced a charge. The 5 pallbearers at Rowe's funeral were arrested by police immediately after the burial, pulled aside at the graveside, and taken in for questioning. They were held for a period and released without charges. It was a gesture that communicated the depth of police frustration without producing anything useful. More than 6,500 people attended the funeral service at a church on Wabash Avenue. Thousands more lined the street outside who could not get in. His casket cost $5,000 and was open for viewing. It was the largest funeral for a black Chicagoan since the death of boxer Jack Johnson in 1946. Minister Clarence H. Cobb stood over his body and said that he was a friend of man and that he had a pure heart. The street outside was full of people who had borrowed money from him, whose relatives' medical bills he had covered, whose debts he had forgiven, whose neighborhoods he had invested in during the years when he was the most powerful black businessman on the south side of Chicago. What followed his death illustrated exactly what his life and his resistance had been holding back. Within 2 years of Rowe's murder, the Chicago outfit had absorbed the entire South Side policy operation, the business that Jones and Rowe had built that employed hundreds of people and generated millions of dollars and reinvested substantially in the black community it served, was now entirely under mob control. The outfit stripped out the community investment dimension entirely. The money flowed to Chicago, Kansas City, and the senior leadership of the organization. The policy game under outfit control became the most profitable racket in the city's history, generating an estimated $150 million per year. The people who had built it were dead or gone. The people who had forced them out were running it. Rowe had understood from the beginning what was being asked of him and what the alternative was. Giancana had told him directly. The offer of $250,000 to walk away had been a statement of the organization's intentions as much as a negotiation. Rowe had looked at the situation and decided that what he had built and what it meant to the people around him was worth more than the money being offered and more than the safety that accepting it would have bought.
He had killed a made man in self-defense and won the subsequent murder trial. He had run his operation for years under sustained violent pressure from the most powerful mob organization in the Midwest. He had refused every offer and survived every attack until the cancer arrived and the calculation changed. The men who ordered his killing were identified by name by the Chicago police, who arrested them for questioning in the days after his death. Their motive had been documented for years across FBI files, police records, and court proceedings. The case against them was not a mystery. It was a murder committed by powerful people who had correctly calculated that their power would insulate them from the consequences of committing it.
The case of Theodore Rowe has been officially unsolved since August 4, 1952. Nobody was ever charged, tried, or convicted. The names of the men who ordered and carried out the killing are part of the historical record of the Chicago outfit. Not one of them faced a single legal consequence for it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.